Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wallace here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm an evolutionary epidemiologist with the People's CDC, here with an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. This week, we'll cover the state of global COVID, the state of U.S. COVID, and the Biden administration's apparent decision to end trying to control and prevent COVID. We begin with global COVID. In the graph in red, the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center reports a decrease to 5.7 million new confirmed COVID cases worldwide for the week ending August 21st. That's still more weekly cases than any other COVID wave except Omicron this past winter. The number of global weekly deaths, there in white, underwent another increase to 16,300 deaths this past week, although still less than in all the previous waves. In green, we see a decrease to 48 million new vaccinations administered this week worldwide. This New York Times map shows hotspots over the past week in the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Australasia. There in purple, Austria, Serbia, Greece, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan continue to be epicenters in average daily new cases per 100,000 population. Chile, Russia, and Finland hosted increases in caseloads. Much of the world, on the other hand, appears to be hosting declines in caseloads, including, but not limited to, Mexico, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, Spain, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Mongolia, and after months as epicenters, Australia and New Zealand, although these latter two continue to host rates above much of the world. Here's the 7-day average of daily confirmed COVID cases per million people from the beginning of the outbreak on the left all the way to today on the right. We can see the spikes in cases when Omicron emerged in late 2021. The present hotspots we noted in the previous map are trending in different directions. South Korea and Japan continue to report strong increases. Russia is hosting a slow increase off its reported low levels. The U.S. continues its months-long post-winter surge, if also at a relatively lesser national rate compared to other countries. Taiwan appears to be leveling off its previous surge at a fairly high, steady state. Greece is showing stepwise declines. Chile, Serbia, and Austria continue to have level off. France, Germany, Italy, Australia, and New Zealand are reporting steady declines after months-long epidemics. Our world in data appears no longer reporting national test positivities. But Johns Hopkins shows most countries still way above the control level of 5% positive. Indeed, with daily new tests across the bottom axis there and percent positive along the side, Bosnia, Netherlands, and Cabo Verde are reporting positivities of 60% and more. However, these aren't necessarily random samples, with testing routinely targeted to vulnerable populations. That said, SARS-2 appears nowhere near under a rate of replacement that would see the virus burning out on its own. The sizes of the circles here show the confirmed new cases per population, with the U.S. hosting the largest caseloads in this sample. Here we have COVID deaths per million people for the countries from our caseload series. For some countries, the death rates are tracking their caseloads. Japan and South Korea are showing increases in COVID deaths. Russia is reporting a slight increase. Finland is tracking upwards. Greece is seeing a stepwise decline. Taiwan is showing a steady decline. On the other hand, while New Zealand is reporting a month-long decline in COVID deaths, it's only in the last week that Australia is showing such a decline on what remains an uncertain trajectory. If the world is finally entering its seasonal COVID decline, which is a welcome development, a global caseload of nearly 6 million new infections a week still offers the virus plenty of material to experiment with, solving whatever herd immunities we can muster and our vaccines. Indeed, we find molecular changes from the root of this SARS-2 tree, here numbering as high as 65 amino acid changes and 16 deletions. That is, SARS-2 continues to evolve. Overall, we see in dark blues and purples the early variants like alpha and beta. In the light blue are samples of the Delta variant. We also see over the past 6 months that multiple Omicron subvariants, there in yellow, BA1 and 2, in the light and medium oranges, BA4 and 5, and the darker orange, BA2.12, are continuing to explore SARS-2's evolutionary space. We see in the few red samples the early August arrival of subvariant BA2.75, or the Centaurus variant, found first in India in June. But no new samples have been sequenced since. That might be a matter of a true disappearance, or a lack of sequencing resources in Centaurus's geographic centers. We see all the Omicron subvariants except one of the BA2 clades presently in circulation, indicating Omicron may be conducting parallel experimentation with us in an almost industrial fashion. Turning to the US, we see the country moving in two different directions. On the one hand, this New York Times map shows much of the country in a slight decline in caseloads per 100,000 from a couple weeks ago. The Northeast, Upper Midwest, the coastal Southeast, the Rockies, and much of the West Coast are presently characterized by a relative decline in COVID. The Plain States still host pinpricks of counties still badly hit by outbreaks, with clusters in western North Dakota and Oklahoma, but a relative decline overall. On the other hand, in a different direction, Appalachia, from eastern West Virginia down through western Virginia, much of Kentucky, all of Tennessee, and down into northern Mississippi and northern Alabama, is getting rocked. Alaska is still getting hit hard. Puerto Rico, after months in full outbreak, appears to be showing an island-wide decline in COVID cases. There are other ways of tracking COVID. Indeed, the levels of SARS-2 virus detected in the wastewater that comes through our sewage plants, as reported here August 6th through 20th, shows some but not total overlap with the previous caseload map. Sewage plants in red represent loads at 80 to 100% more than their previously recorded levels. We see these scattered across the US, including places that the previous map showed were cooling off. So these include Oregon and western Washington state, Nebraska, Illinois, parts of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio, and upstate and downstate New York. We do see cooled off blues in and around Seattle, down the California coast, and parts of Colorado and Texas, and we see big drop-offs in Miami and New Jersey. Clearly, SARS-2 spatial dynamics are structured at multiple levels. There are regional dynamics, there are statewide dynamics, clusters and counties, and at the level of our poop catchment are sewage plants. Indeed, we see such small area variation by looking at the change in sewage caseloads over the past 15 days, seeing, for instance, Illinois and New York State here marked by contours of red-hot increases side by side with cooled-off sewage spots. To sum up, we see much of the country, 92% of U.S. counties, filled in at the highest level of community transmission, as measured by the CDC as a combination of cases per 100,000 the last 7 days, and percent positive tests up to 10% or more. Only parts of Nevada and the Plain States, Colorado and Vermont appear in any measure of retraction. The CDC map suffers from two foundational methodological errors. First, it shows continuous differences in transmission as categorical differences in color. Second, it fails to differentiate counties by percent positive tests above 10% or more. All that red certainly is alarming. It is alarming, but the map is nigh on useless in alerting Americans the extent to which they are, in their county, exposed to circulating COVID. It's for this reason the People's CDC is moving toward presenting the same data in a new way. In our new map, devised by our weather report team and our quant group, the single color better grades the COVID danger counties differ by in a more continuous way. But in addition, we now can differentiate the high level of danger counties are subjected to. Down at the bottom, we see that the People's CDC also now differentiates exposure by both percent of counties and by percent population. We can see here that by population, 98% of the American people are in communities subjected to extremely high COVID exposure, especially as of August 24th, across the lower Midwest, Appalachia, the Southeast, and moving west into Oklahoma. The People's CDC thinks the map better alerts the American people of their local exposure, and it appears a wider swath of the U.S. is now subjected to graver exposure than indicated by the New York Times map we began with. And this exposure at a moment when the infectious BA.5 subvariant continues to dominate the SARS-2 playing field. As on the global stage, SARS-2 continues to evolve here in the US. We can see here new variants first emerging and dominating in cycles of every 2 months. The BA.2 Omicron subvariant in pink was replaced by the BA.2.12 subvariant in orange, which is now being replaced by subvariants BA.4 and 5 in green, with BA.5 surging ahead to account for 89% of new cases this past week. We now also see the emergence of Omicron subvariant BA.4.6 in blue, now up to over 6% of new cases. We see then that the pandemic continues to turn here in the States. We end this week's COVID This Week on the US response. As it has been hinting at one policy change, leaked memo at a time, the Biden administration appears on its way to quitting trying to control COVID. And we mean controlling it at all. What began with pre-inauguration plans for a Rooseveltian pandemic testing board a national contact tracing program run through a public health jobs corps, and applying the Defense Production Act to producing enough personal protection equipment for everyone. None of these were pursued. What began with these plans is now stripped down to less than what the Trump administration eventually offered. We learned earlier in the month that the CDC had dropped recommendations for quarantining at home and testing people without symptoms. People who do still test positive should stay home for 5 days, not 10 as previously recommended, the CDC continued, although people without symptoms and no longer getting tested now wouldn't know to do so. The contact tracing the administration promised but never really followed up with is now over, save in hospitals and nursing homes. By autumn, the administration plans on ending funding for everyday people's access to vaccines, testing, and treatment. CNN reports that the administration is aiming to get through COVID's crisis phase. In contrast, the People CDC has concluded we get through the COVID crisis phase by controlling the virus and preventing infections. We don't get through the crisis by ending funding for the very tools the administration claimed allowed the U.S. to end sheltering in place and to reopen the economy. Meanwhile, the CDC at one and the same time, all along defending every single one of its decisions up to this point, also lambasted itself off the results of an independent review of the agency. The CDC got out ahead on the report by pronouncing on the report's results even before the report was finished and released for outside experts and the public to comment on. In response to the report, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky placed a lot of emphasis on streamlining the agency's capacity to make decisions and act on them. There are plans for expanding the executive suite to better facilitate turning data into decisions, on collecting data for action rather than for research, as if those two were separated, and hiring more public health officers for longer terms, without commenting on the demoralization that sent many an officer fleeing the agency. Upgrading institutional operations isn't a bad thing, but the whole affair has an air of rearranging the chairs on the deck of a sinking ship. The issue isn't merely how such a large agency works, but for whom. Established in 1946, the CDC has always acted as if one of the Bretton Woods organizations like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, dedicated to helping run global capitalism in the American model. It aimed to stop diseases emerging out of the expropriation American companies conducted abroad from boomeranging back to the global north. But the US is on the far side of its cycle of accumulation and its high point in building empire. Its political class is now in the business of helping its financial supporters cash out, turning capital into money. In that way, the CDC itself is what it fails to intervene in. By dint of our historical moment, the CDC won't address the capitalism that drove the emergence of the outbreak at one end of our epidemiologies and defunded and monetized public health at the other, no matter how well the deck chairs are rearranged. And that's COVID this week from the People CDC. We do not have the $12 billion budget the CDC annually spends, but we are trying our best to model what an epidemiology for the people could look like. You can learn more about the People CDC and read this week's COVID weather report at peoplecdc.org.